Hello, halfway students and families. This is Mrs. Koberchek reading Chapter 24 of Cryptid Hunters. Mausolito. When Marty climbed back up to the sky house with the parrot on his shoulder, PD greeted him with Grace's blue tag in her mouth. The chain was broken, as if it had been torn from her neck. He was now certain that Butch McCall had taken his sister. Bo, PD, and the parrot sat on the sofa watching him frantically sort through his gear in the shadowy kerosene light. He had no idea how long it was going to take to find her, or how he was going to get her away from him, but he was going to get her back, no matter what it took. He put a headlamp on his forehead, then tried the pack on for size. It was a little heavy. PD barked. "Don't worry," Marty said. "I'm going to take you with me. I'm just trying the pack to see." A head popped through the trap door, and it certainly didn't belong to Grace. PD jumped into Bo's arms. Marty was tempted to do the same. The man pulled himself up the rest of the way. He had gray hair, stood about 4 feet tall, and was naked except for a loincloth made out of okapi skin. He was carrying a long bow slung over his shoulder. Slung over his shoulder was an arrow quiver made out of the same material as his loincloth. His feet were bare. The parrot flew over to him and landed on his shoulder. "Mausolito?" Without responding, the man walked over to the sofa and took a close look at Bo and PD, who growled but didn't bark. "My name is Marty." Ignoring him, the pygmy put the bow and quiver down and quickly climbed up to the second floor. Marty followed him with the lantern, wondering if the man was a deaf mute. He watched as the man checked under the bed and in the closet. "What are you looking for?" Marty asked. "I'm here alone. My sister was..." The pygmy walked into the nursery. Marty tried a few awkward phrases in French, which was commonly spoken in the Congo, but the little man continued to ignore him. He finished whatever he was doing in the nursery and climbed up to the roof. Again, Marty tagged along and watched as the pygmy looked under the water tank, over the rail, and in the storage shed. "I know you don't understand a word I'm saying," Marty said, "but I don't have time to entertain guests right now. My sister has been kidnapped, and I have to go out and find her." The pygmy picked up the molimo. "Is that what you were looking for? I'm the one who called you." Marty pointed at it. "Molimo." For the first time, the pygmy seemed interested in what Marty was saying. "Molimo," Marty repeated, then pantomimed blowing on it. He pointed to himself, then said very slowly, "My name is Marty. My uncle, Travis Wolfe, is a friend of yours." He pointed to the pygmy. "Mausolito?" The pygmy nodded. Marty smiled. "Now we're getting somewhere." Mausolito carried the molimo down to the main floor and took a seat on the sofa next to Bo and PD. The parrot was still perched on his bony shoulder. The foursome looked like they were waiting for their favorite TV show to come on. How am I going to explain the situation? Marty thought desperately. He looked around the dim room for something to help him and saw his sketch pad. The path Laurel had chosen was difficult, treacherous, filled with quicksand, swamps, snakes, and swarms of biting insects. But she assured Wolfe that it would get them to the sky house, at least a day earlier. They finally stopped just before dark. They were wet, hungry, and exhausted. Wearily, Wolfe took the gizmo out to see if Marty had sent another email. He hadn't. He checked the tracking tags, which were all blinking in the sky house, then reread Marty's last email and shook his head. "What's the matter?" Laurel asked. "Marty's email," Wolfe answered. "I've been thinking about it all day. There's something not quite right about it. For one thing, he called the gizmo a pocket computer. I've never used that term, and I've never heard him use it either. Why didn't he just call it the gizmo?" "I don't know," Laurel said, "but I'm feeling uneasy too." He turned on the bow cam and saw Marty sitting on the floor, drawing something in his sketch pad. There was no sign of Grace. He handed the gizmo to Laurel. "Grace must be out of Bo's camera range. Maybe we should just rest here a few hours and push on before light." "That might be best." They ate some food without bothering to heat it, then climbed into their hammocks, but sleep did not come to either of them. Wolfe checked in with Phil back on Kryptos, then skimmed through his email without enthusiasm, answering none of it. He no longer even cared about the Mokulamembi and the possibility that they were still alive. The only thing that mattered was reaching Grace, Marty, and Mazzelito. "Are you awake?" he asked Laurel. "Yes." "Do you have any other shortcuts to Lake Telly up your sleeve?" "I was just thinking about that," Laurel answered. "Mazzelito told me about one, but I haven't traveled it myself. It's flooded most of the year and impassable. But if the water's down, we could be at the Sky House in a couple days, maybe less. And if the water's up, we would have to backtrack, and that would add a couple days. What do you think?" I think it might be worth the risk. We need to reach those kids." "I agree," Wolfe said. They lay quietly for a long time, listening to the wind blow through the canopy and the night animals calling back and forth. Then Wolfe broke the silence. "I left a few details out last night about my last trip here. You don't have to." "No, I want to," Wolfe interrupted. "Just before Rose died, she made me promise to continue searching for cryptids. I promised her I would, and I made her another promise, which has been hardest to keep." He paused. "Rose and I had a child when we were here. Grace is my daughter." Laurel sat up. "The nursery," Wolfe nodded. "I asked Mazzelito about it when he showed me the Sky House, but he refused to say anything. I asked him to stay quiet about it. Grace has no idea." Wolfe shook his head. "Why would you let her and Marty think?" "Rose insisted that Noah Blackwood must never know about Grace, even if it meant giving her up for adoption." "Why?" "I'm not certain. There were a lot of things I didn't know about the Blackwood family. Things Rose refused to talk about. Her father, her childhood. I knew Rose better than anyone in the world, but there were things she held back. And it wasn't that she distrusted me. There were just some things she wasn't allowed to share with anyone. I know this doesn't make sense, but I'm trying to explain why I made the decision to give Grace up. Rose knew that Blackwood would somehow gain custody of Grace, that he would corrupt and ruin her. I don't know how she knew this, but I believed her. When I was moved from the Liboko village to the hospital, I called my sister Sylvia. She had given birth to Marty 6 weeks before Grace was born. She and Tim took her into their lives without question and raised her as their own. Giving her up was the hardest thing I ever had to do. The second hardest was staying out of her life all these years. Is that why you've been so distant from Grace? Of course, Wolfe said. How can I explain why I gave her up when I don't understand it myself? That is a problem, Laurel said. Why did your sister put them into a boarding school? Sylvia wasn't exactly a stay-at-home mom type. She and Tim actually wanted to take the kids with them on their assignments, but there was a problem. Grace looked exactly like Rose. Someone was bound to do a story on the famous O'Hara family. All Blackwood would have to do is see one photograph of Grace in a newspaper or magazine, and he would know immediately that she was not their little girl. It was an agonizing decision for all of us, but in the end, the boarding school seemed like the best alternative. As the years went by, it became more and more difficult to reverse the decision. Wolfe sighed. Looking back on it, I think it was a colossal mistake. What about now? Laurel asked. Won't Grace being with you expose her? It's a risk, Wolfe admitted. What I do is done in secret. We don't talk to the press, publish scientific papers, or advertise what we're doing. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm a little camera shy. Laurel grinned. I've noticed. Anyway, I think I'll be able to keep Grace away from Blackwood until she reaches legal age. At that point, Blackwood won't be able to touch her. Are you going to tell her about all this? Yes, Wolfe said, and that will be the third hardest thing I've ever had to do. I've been waiting for the right moment, and to be frank, the courage. I just hope she doesn't hate me too much when I tell her the truth. Laurel reached across to his hammock and took his hand. I think she'll understand. Marty put the final touches on his masterpiece. Despite the speed with which he had to work and his anxiety over Grace's disappearance, he couldn't help but be pleased with the results. Luther would love this, he thought as he sorted the pages into the right order. I just hope the pygmy with the okapi underpants on understands it. He gathered the sheets and kneeled in front of Mazzelito and his 3 friends. This is a comic book, he said very slowly. The difference is that everything in this story really happened. I am not kidding. He showed him the first panel, which was a black and white sketch of his parents climbing into a helicopter. He would have preferred to work in color, but there wasn't time. The next panel was the most difficult for him to draw. The helicopter crash and his parents wandering off into the wilderness. The next several panels had been much easier to draw. A portrait of him and Grace at school. The flight to Kryptos. A portrait of Wolfe. Mazzelito being chased through the jungle by Blackwood's cutthroats. Their fall from the jet. He pantomimed each panel to help Mazzelito understand. When he got to the panel showing Grace's abduction, he had to make up the details. He started by showing several men storming the sky house. Grace valiantly struggling to get away, a man tearing the tracking tag from her neck, and finally, his sister succumbing. The very last panel was of Marty on the roof playing the molimo. That's what happened, Marty concluded. Mazzelito nodded as if he understood and said something that Marty didn't understand. I don't speak pygmy, Marty said. Mazzelito got up and started rummaging through Marty's art supplies. What are you doing? Mazzelito came back to the sofa with a fistful of colored pencils. We don't have time for this, Marty protested. We've got to find Grace. Mazzelito smiled, then took the pad from him and sat down on the sofa and started drawing. We don't have time for this, Marty repeated, but with much less conviction. Mazzelito knew how to hold a pencil and was making self-assured strokes on the pad. Marty started around the back of the sofa to get a look at what he was doing, but Mazzelito stopped him in his tracks with a pygmy stink eye. Just like Luther, Marty said. Luther hated people looking over his shoulder while he drew. Of course, if I drew like Luther, Marty thought, I'd hate it too. He sat down in the chair and watched the bats drop from the ceiling in 2s and 3s and fly out through the broken window. Mazzelito did not look up from his work.